The snow fell with a steady hush, like the world had been draped in silence. Every flake a whisper of judgment against the lonely cabin half buried in white. Wind prowled through the pines, rattling their frozen needles, carrying with it the faintest scent of woods and the promise of another bitter night. Inside the air was thick with shadows and the faint glow of dying embers. The fire crouching low in the hearth as if it too was surrendering. On the rough plank floor lay Ruth and Whitlock, her breath shallow, face marred by bruises the color of storm clouds. Her body worn thin from cruelty and hunger, shivered beneath a ragged quilt. Two boys knelt at her side, twins mirror images of fear and desperation, their small hands grasping hers, as if touch alone could tether her to the world. Jonas, the elder by mere minutes, clenched his jaw like a man twice his age, though his eyes betrayed the boy he still was. Jesse, softer and quieter, pressed his cheek to his mother's arm, whispering words not meant for the world but for her alone. The room seemed to listen, the creak of the walls holding their plea. Outside, snow tapped against the window like impatient knuckles, but the boys did not hear. Their whole world lay on the floor before them, slipping away with each ragged rise of Ruth Ann's chest. Life had not been gentle with her. Once years back, Ruth Ann had carried the glow of youth in her face, but gossip had a way of stripping a woman down quicker than time. The town had never forgiven her for birthing two sons at once, as if the twins themselves were an omen. Martha Glee, her mother-in-law, had called her cursed, too weak for farm work, too fragile for ranch life. Ezekiel, the father-in-law, had never lifted a hand in her defense. Instead, his stern silence gave permission for the bitterness to spread like rot, and rot it did. Through words, through deeds, through the bruises she learned to cover with sleeves and quietness. To live in that house was to learn invisibility. Yet children see what others refuse. And Jonas and Jesse had watched their mother diminish piece by piece. Until now, all that was left was a faint flicker. Jonas's voice cracked the silence, low but firm. "We can't stay. She'll die if we do." His hands trembled as he smoothed a lock of her hair away from her swollen face. "We got to find him." Jess's eyes widened, catching the weight of his brother's meaning. They had heard the stories whispered among townsfolk, tales of a giant who lived alone in the mountains, a man with a beard like a thicket and arms like tree trunks. Some said he had killed men with his bare hands. Others swore he'd once had a family but lost them to winter. Children dared each other to walk toward the timberline and glimpse his cabin. Ruth Ann had never spoken of him. Yet the boys in their secret places had wondered. And now in this moment of despair, that wondering took the shape of hope. "Do you think he'd help us?" Jesse whispered, his voice thin as the smoke curling from the hearth. Jonas swallowed hard. "He has to. There ain't no one else." Snow bit at their cheeks as they opened the door, leaving their mother in the weak glow of the hearth. The storm welcomed them with claws of wind and silence so deep it hummed. Their boots sank into drifts, and their breaths rose like ghosts into the night. They walked hand in hand, two small figures swallowed by a wilderness that cared nothing for them. Behind them, the cabin sagged against the storm, its faint light flickering as though it might be snuffed out. Far above in a clearing where pines bowed beneath the snow, Thaddeus Boone struck steel to wood. His axe split the night with each swing, echoing like a heartbeat against the frozen world. He was a man built of silence and solitude, his shoulders wide enough to carry logs that others would have needed mules for. His beard was thick with frost, his hair falling wild down his back. The years had carved him hard but not unfailing. He had lived too long without laughter, too long with nothing but the cry of wolves to remind him of voices in the dark. His cabin was small but solid, its smoke curling upward into the starless sky when the twins staggered from the tree line, their small figures trembling in the storm. Thaddeus paused mid-swing. The axe buried itself into the block and for a long moment he only stared. Two children barely clothed against the cold, their cheeks raw, their eyes wide with something fiercer than fear, desperation. Jonas took a halting step forward. His words came out in gasps. "Mister, our mama, she's dying." Thaddeus blinked once, the snow gathering in his beard. He had spent years turning away from the world, letting its cruelties pass without his hand in them. But the sight of those boys, with their frostbitten hope and their mother's life pressed between their words, rooted him to something he thought had long since withered. Without reply, he strode forward, scooping Jesse into one arm. Jonas into the other, carrying them as if they were no heavier than firewood. His long strides broke through the drifts as he turned toward the faint glow in the distance. The cabin door groaned as he pushed it open, his frame filling the space. The heat of the dying fire touched his skin, and he smelled sickness, fear, and faint traces of blood. Ruam lay sprawled, barely conscious, her eyes fluttering open to the sight of him. A stranger, a giant. Shame flickered across her face as though even in her weakness, she feared what judgment might fall upon her. Thaddeus crouched, his shadow looming over her small broken frame. He pressed his fingers to her wrist, felt the thready pulse, the life so faint it seemed one sigh might scatter it. For a moment the giant closed his eyes, something long buried flickering across his face. A memory perhaps, or a grief that matched hers. Then, without a word, he slid his arms beneath her. She weighed nothing to him, though the weight of her suffering pressed heavy on his chest. The twins followed as he carried her out into the night. Snow clawed at their faces, but Thaddeus moved like a force of nature, every step sure, every breath measured. His cabin welcomed them with the glow of firelight, warmth rushing to meet them as he shouldered the door open. He laid Ruthann gently upon his bed, covering her with furs. The boys clung together in the corner, eyes wide, watching this wild man move with a tenderness they had never seen from kin. He boiled water, crushed herbs from jars long stored, and pressed cloth to her wounds. His hands were rough, scarred, but his touch was steady. Ruthann stirred, moaned, tried to turn away, but he hushed her without words, only the patience of his presence. Her lashes fluttered against her cheek, and she caught fragments of his face, the wild beard, the fierce eyes softened by firelight. A question formed on her lips, but never found voice. The boys crept closer, Jesse clutching Jonas's sleeve. Is she going to die? Thaddeus did not answer. He wrung out the cloth, laid it gently against her brow, then added another log to the fire. Flames climbed, shadows leapt, and for the first time in days, the room breathed warmth. He sat by the bedside, elbows resting on his knees, gaze fixed on her fragile breaths. Outside, the storm battered the walls, but inside the silence was heavy, intimate. Hours passed, measured by the crackle of wood and the rise and fall of Ruthann's chest. Her color returned, faint, but present. Her lips parted and she whispered words too soft to catch. Thaddeus leaned closer, the scent of snow still clinging to his skin. She opened her eyes only halfway, pupils swimming in fever, and fixed on him as though she saw something both terrifying and merciful. Why? Her voice was raw, broken. Why would a man like you help a woman like me? The question hung between them, fragile as glass. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. Thaddeus did not reply. He only shifted, lifted another log, and set it gently upon the flames. The room, filled with light, wrapping them all in warmth. Jonas and Jesse, exhausted, curled against each other and drifted into sleep. Ruan's gaze lingered on the giant beside her, searching for an answer in a silence. And though he said nothing, the air carried its own reply. That sometimes salvation comes not with words, but with the quiet act of refusing to let a soul slip into the dark. Her eyes closed again, but this time not with surrender. This time with the faintest spark of return. The storm raged on outside, howling against the cabin walls. But within something shifted, an unspoken promise born in firelight and silence. Snow softened the mountains into silence. And for the first time in years, Thaddeus Boone woke to the sound of breathing that was not his own. The cabin, once filled only with the rhythm of his own solitude, now carried the gentle sighs of Ruthann and the restless stirring of two boys who had claimed corners as their sanctuary. Light filtered through the frosted window panes, touching dust motes that swam in the air, gilding the room with a fragile kind of grace. Thaddeus sat by the fire, sharpening his knife. But his eyes lingered often on the bed where Ruthann lay, her color stronger than the night he first carried her in. Every scrape of steel against stone was a vow unspoken. She would not fall while he drew breath. Days passed in a rhythm both strange and familiar. Thaddeus cooked beans and venison stew, the smell of it drawing Jesse close with wide-eyed hunger. Ruthann, though still weak, insisted on mending his torn shirts, the thread shaking in her hand, but steady enough to stitch. There was no declaration of gratitude, no apology for invading his solitude, only small acts of presence. Each gesture wove a quiet thread between them, binding man, woman, and children in a pattern none had expected. The boys laughed for the first time in months when Thaddeus lifted them both at once, and set them upon his shoulders, their giggles ringing against the rafters like a hymn he had long forgotten. Yet with every flicker of warmth came the shadow of judgment. For outside these walls, the world was not blind, and tongues wagged even through the storm. When the weather broke, and Ruth was able to walk into town with her boys, whispers followed them like smoke. Women leaned close, voices sharp as needles, living under the roof of that wild man. Men muttered of shame, of scandal, of what kind of mother chose the company of a recluse over her own kin. Martha and Ezekiel burned with fury, their words painting ruin as wayward, ungrateful, a harlot hiding behind a giant shadow. Sheriff Abram Coyle, torn between the law and the sway of the townsfolk, came to Thaddeus's cabin soon after, boots crunching in the snow. His gaze lingered on Ruth and then shifted to the children, clinging to her skirts. He cleared his throat, uneasy. Folks are talking. They want her back with her people. You can't keep her here. Thaddeus stood silent, towering over the sheriff until the lawman's words dried in his throat. The firelight painted his face in hard lines, his silence heavier than any argument. Ruthin trembled under the sheriff's eyes, shame flushing her cheeks. Yet she did not move. Thaddeus said only one thing, voice low as thunder rolling down a canyon. She stays. It was enough. Abram tipped his hat and left. Though his face carried warning, the message was clear. The town would not leave them be. That night, Ruthin sat by the hearth, her fingers twisting in her lap. The boys slept near the fire, their faces softened by its glow. She whispered, not looking at Thaddeus. I was never wanted, not even when I was a bride. To them, I was a burden, a mistake. I don't know how to be anything else. Her words trembled like branches in wind. Thaddeus, sitting across from her, let the silence stretch, then leaned forward, his eyes steady on hers. You were always more than they could bear to see. The simplicity of it struck harder than any sermon. She lowered her gaze, but her lips parted as though to hold on to those words, fragile as they were. The days thickened with tension. Ruan grew stronger, her boys more alive, but the storm beyond the cabin was not of snow. It was the weight of judgment pressing in. Martha and Ezekiel returned with venom, standing in the snow outside the cabin, spitting accusations of sin, of shame, of a mother who abandoned her duty. You'll rot in hell for this. Martha screeched, her voice slicing the cold air. Thaddeus stood in the doorway, immovable as stone, while Ruthin shrank back, shame pinning her like a blade. The boys pressed close to her, their fear trembling through their small hands. The in-laws demanded she return, demanded the children be raised under their roof, demanded Thaddeus release her, but the mountain man did not waver. His silence, vast and heavy, sent them away that night, but not without a promise they would come back. Inside, Ruthin wept, her hands covering her face. They'll never let me live in peace. And you, they'll take everything from you because of me. Thaddeus said nothing, only sat by the fire, sharpening his knife. The sound was steady, deliberate, a rhythm of patience and warning. She looked at him through blurred eyes, and in his quiet strength she found a strange comfort, though fear gnawed at her still. The twins, half asleep, mumbled, "Please, Mama, don't go back. Please don't leave us here." Their words burned through her despair, lodging deep in her heart. The night of reckoning came as the storm returned. Snow slashing sideways in the wind, the world swallowed in white fury. Torches glowed against the darkness as Martha, Ezekiel, and a handful of townsmen approached the cabin, their voices raised in anger. They would burn it down, they cried, smoke out the wild man, and reclaim what they believed theirs. The wolves howled in the distance as though the wilderness itself bore witness. Inside, the fire crackled, and Ruthin stood trembling, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thaddeus rose, filling the doorway, his shadow cast long by the fire. He did not speak, yet his presence alone was defiance, a wall of flesh and will no flame could consume. But the moment that turned the night did not belong to him. It belonged to Ruthann. She stepped forward, her body weak, but her spirit ignited, standing at his side, though her knees shook. Her voice cracked with fear and cold, carried over the storm. I am no one's burden. My sons and I belong where kindness lives. You cannot take that from us. Her words rang raw, trembling, but they burned brighter than any torch raised against her. The mob faltered, startled by a strength they had never seen in the woman they once beat into silence. Martha's face twisted with rage. Ezekiel's jaw tightened, but behind them, the others shifted uneasily, shame creeping in with the wind. No man dared move against the giant, standing silent as stone, nor against the woman who had found her voice at last. The torches hissed in the snow, dropped one by one, their fire dying in the drifts. Slowly, the mob retreated, their fury scattered by the storm and by the sight of two souls unbroken before them. Martha's curses trailed off into the night, carried away by wind. The storm swallowed them, leaving only silence behind. Ruth collapsed to her knees, breath shuddering, the boys rushing into her arms. Thaddeus stood above them, his chest heaving with quiet strength, his eyes fixed not on the retreating mob, but on the fragile, fierce woman who had risen from her own ashes. Dawn broke slow and golden, laying its light upon the snow-draped world. The storm had passed, the wolves had fallen silent, and the cabin stood untouched, smoke curling into the morning air. Ruth Ann stepped outside, her sons beside her, their faces lifted toward the pale sun. Thaddeus joined them, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the snow. For the first time, he did not feel the weight of solitude pressing on him. For the first time, she did not feel the chain of shame dragging her down. They stood together, bound not by vows nor law, but by the fragile, stubborn grace of survival and love unspoken. The narrator's voice, soft as wind through pines, lingers here. A woman once beaten now stood unbroken. A man once alone now carried the weight of love. Snow may bury many things, but it cannot bury the human will to rise again. And remember this, dear soul,